The cafeteria at Riverside Middle School erupted into chaos as three eighth-grade boys cornered Marcus Thompson near the lunch line. Without warning, Jake Morrison grabbed Marcus by his shirt collar and yanked him backward while his friends Tyler, Chen and Brandon Walsh formed a menacing circle around the smaller seventh grader. Marcus stumbled, his lunch tray clattering to the floor as apple sauce and chocolate milk splattered across the linoleum. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The entire room seemed to freeze for a split second before exploding into a frenzy of gasps, pointing fingers, and cell phones being pulled out to record what everyone assumed would be another humiliating beatdown. But what Marcus did next would not only shock every student in that cafeteria, but would ultimately expose a web of corruption that had been poisoning their school district for years. His response would transform not just his own life, but the lives of countless students who had suffered in silence under a broken system that protected bullies while punishing victims. Marcus Thompson had always been different from the other kids at Riverside Middle School. While most 12-year-olds spent their free time playing video games or scrolling through social media, Marcus could be found in the school library hunched over thick books about civil rights history or computer programming. His grandmother, who had raised him since he was 4 years old after his parents died in a car accident, often joked that Marcus had been born with an old soul and a curious mind that never stopped asking questions. Standing barely 5 feet tall with wire-rimmed glasses that always seemed to be sliding down his nose, Marcus was an easy target for the school's more aggressive students. His quiet demeanor and academic focus made him stand out in ways that attracted unwanted attention from kids who seemed to find joy in making others miserable. But what most people didn't know about Marcus was that beneath his gentle exterior lay a sharp intellect and an unwavering sense of justice that he had inherited from his grandmother, Dorothy Thompson, a retired teacher who had spent 40 years fighting for educational equity in their community. The incident on that Tuesday afternoon in late October had been building for weeks. Jake Morrison, an 8th grader who stood nearly 6 feet tall, despite being only 14, had been systematically targeting Marcus since the beginning of the school year. It started with small things, knocking books out of Marcus's hands in the hallway, making loud comments about his clothes during class, or deliberately bumping into him hard enough to send him stumbling. Jake's two constant companions, Tyler and Brandon, always laughed at these incidents and sometimes participated by blocking Marcus's path or making crude jokes about his appearance. The 3 boys were known throughout Riverside Middle School as untouchable. Jake's father, Robert Morrison, was the chairman of the school board and owned several successful businesses in town. Tyler's mother, Linda Chen, was the superintendent of the entire district and had been in that position for over a decade. Brandon's family, the Walshes, had deep roots in local politics and had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to various school programs over the years. This powerful network of influence meant that complaints about the boys' behavior mysteriously disappeared from official records. Teachers who tried to discipline them found themselves facing administrative pressure, and parents who spoke up often discovered that their concerns were dismissed or ignored entirely. Marcus had tried to handle the situation on his own at first. He attempted to avoid the 3 bullies by taking different routes between classes, eating lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria, and staying after school until he was sure they had left the building. But Jake seemed to take Marcus's avoidance as a personal challenge, escalating his harassment and recruiting other students to participate in what he called the nerd hunt. The psychological torture had been wearing Marcus down, affecting his grades and his sleep, until his grandmother finally noticed the change in his behavior and demanded to know what was happening at school. Dorothy Thompson was not a woman who accepted injustice quietly. When Marcus finally confided in her about the ongoing harassment, she immediately contacted the school administration to file a formal complaint. Her first meeting was with the assistant principal, Mr. David Rodriguez, a well-meaning but overwhelmed administrator. who seemed genuinely concerned about Marcus's situation. Mr. Rodriguez assured Dorothy that he would investigate the matter thoroughly and take appropriate action to ensure Marcus's safety. However, when Dorothy followed up a week later, she was told that the investigation had found insufficient evidence of any wrongdoing, and that perhaps Marcus was being overly sensitive to normal teenage interactions. The dismissive tone and obvious lack of any real investigation infuriated Dorothy, who had seen this pattern before during her decades as an educator. She recognized the signs of institutional protection for privileged students and the systematic minimization of complaints from families without political connections. Determined to document the ongoing harassment, Dorothy began keeping detailed records of every incident Marcus reported. She photographed bruises on his arms from being shoved in the hallways, saved screenshots of cruel social media posts targeting her grandson, and even installed a small recording device in Marcus's backpack to capture audio evidence of the verbal abuse he endured daily. What she discovered through this process shocked her even more than the bullying itself. The audio recordings revealed that Jake, Tyler, and Brandon were not just randomly cruel teenagers acting out for attention. Their conversations showed a sophisticated understanding of their own immunity from consequences and a deliberate strategy for tormenting students who lacked powerful family connections. They discussed specific teachers who had been dealt with after attempting to discipline them, referenced meetings between their parents and school administrators where complaints had been buried, and even bragged about other students who had been forced to transfer schools after being targeted by their group. Most disturbing of all, the recordings captured Jake explicitly stating that his father had assured him he could do whatever he wanted to students like Marcus because their families didn't matter. In the community, this revelation made it clear to Dorothy that the harassment her grandson was experiencing was not just teenage cruelty, but part of a larger pattern of abuse enabled by systemic corruption within the school district. Armed with this evidence, Dorothy requested another meeting with school administrators, this time demanding to speak directly with Principal Sarah Martinez. The meeting, held on a cold Monday morning in the principal's office, was attended by Principal Martinez, Assistant Principal Rodriguez, and the school's legal counsel, Mrs. Rebecca Foster. Dorothy presented her carefully organized documentation, including transcripts of the recorded conversations, photographs of Marcus's injuries, and a timeline showing the escalation of harassment despite multiple reports to school staff. Principal Martinez, a career educator who had been at Riverside Middle School for only 2 years, listened to Dorothy's presentation with obvious discomfort. Unlike some of the other administrators Dorothy had encountered, Principal Martinez seemed genuinely disturbed by the evidence and appeared to be taking notes throughout the meeting. However, when Dorothy finished her presentation and demanded immediate action against the 3 bullies, the principal's response was carefully measured and ultimately disappointing. Principal Martinez explained that while she took Dorothy's concerns very seriously, she was limited in what actions she could take without following proper district procedures. She promised a thorough investigation, but warned that any disciplinary measures would need to be approved by the superintendent's office and could potentially face legal challenges from the families involved. The principal also suggested that perhaps the best solution would be to transfer Marcus to a different school, where he might fit in better with his peer group. Dorothy left that meeting feeling more frustrated than ever. It was clear that even administrators who recognized the problem felt powerless to address it. Because of the political realities within the district, the suggestion that Marcus should be the one to leave his school, rather than the bullies facing consequences for their behavior, perfectly illustrated the backwards priorities that allowed this situation to continue unchecked. That evening, Dorothy sat down with Marcus for a serious conversation about their options. She explained that the school system seemed unwilling or unable to protect him, and that they might need to consider alternatives like transferring to a private school or even moving to a different district. But Marcus, despite being only 12 years old, surprised his grandmother with the maturity and determination of his response. Marcus told Dorothy that running away would not solve the real problem. and would only allow Jake, Tyler, and Brandon to continue terrorizing other vulnerable students. He had been thinking deeply about the situation and had come to the conclusion that the harassment he was experiencing was connected to larger issues of power and inequality that his grandmother had taught him about through their discussions of civil rights history. Marcus said he wanted to find a way to not just stop the bullying, but to expose the system that protected bullies while silencing their victims. Dorothy was both proud of and worried about her grandson's determination to fight back. She recognized the same sense of justice that had driven her own career in education, but she also understood the risks of challenging powerful families and entrenched institutional interests. After much discussion, they agreed that Marcus would continue documenting incidents while Dorothy researched the backgrounds of the families involved and the district's disciplinary policies to look for patterns of favoritism or corruption. What Dorothy discovered through her research was even more extensive than she had imagined. Public records showed that Robert Morrison's companies had received numerous no-bid contracts from the school district worth millions of dollars over the past 5 years. Superintendent Linda Chen had previously worked as a consultant for Morrison's businesses before being hired by the district, creating obvious conflicts of interest that had never been disclosed. The Walsh family's charitable donations to the school system came with strings attached that gave them influence over hiring decisions and policy changes. Most troubling of all, Dorothy found evidence of a pattern stretching back nearly a decade where complaints against the children of these influential families were systematically buried or dismissed. Students who persisted in reporting harassment often found themselves facing disciplinary action for false accusations or disruptive behavior. Several families had been forced to pursue expensive legal action just to get their children's safety concerns taken seriously, and even then, the outcomes were typically sealed settlements that prevented public disclosure of the district's failures. Armed with this broader context, Dorothy realized that Marcus's situation was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger story about how wealth and political connections could corrupt educational institutions. She began reaching out to other parents whose children had been victimized by the same group of bullies or similar situations involving protected students. What she found was a network of families who had been silenced, intimidated, or simply given up trying to get justice through official channels. Meanwhile, at school, Marcus was implementing his own strategy for dealing with the ongoing harassment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead of continuing to avoid Jake, Tyler, and Brandon, he began carefully observing their behavior and documenting their activities. Marcus had always been good with technology, and he used these skills to discreetly record incidents and gather evidence that might be useful. Later, he also started building relationships with other students who had been targeted by the 3 bullies, creating an informal support network of victims who could corroborate each other's experiences. The breakthrough moment came when Marcus discovered that Jake had been using school computers to hack into other students' accounts and steal personal information that was then used for cyberbullying campaigns. Marcus's computer skills allowed him to trace these activities and document the digital evidence in a way that would be difficult for the school administration to dismiss or ignore. This discovery gave him and his grandmother the smoking gun. They needed to prove that the harassment was not just physical and verbal, but included serious violations of digital privacy and cybercrime. However, Jake seemed to sense that Marcus was becoming more assertive and less intimidated by the ongoing harassment. The bullying began to escalate in both frequency and severity, as if Jake was determined to break Marcus's spirit before he could cause any real trouble for the established order. Teachers who had previously turned a blind eye to the harassment began to notice the increasingly aggressive behavior, but their attempts to intervene were consistently undermined by administrative pressure to avoid creating problems with influential families. The situation reached a boiling point on that Tuesday afternoon in late October, when Marcus entered the cafeteria for lunch period. He had been carrying a folder containing printouts of the digital evidence he had gathered, planning to show it to a trusted teacher after lunch. Jake spotted the folder and seemed to recognize that Marcus was up to something that could threaten his position of immunity within the school. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as an unprovoked assault that crossed every line of acceptable behavior. Jake approached Marcus from behind as he waited in the lunch line and grabbed him by the shirt collar, yanking him backward with enough force to lift the smaller boy off his feet. As Marcus stumbled and dropped his lunch tray, Tyler and Brandon moved in to form a circle around him, preventing other students from intervening and creating a sense of spectacle that drew everyone's attention. The cafeteria, which had been filled with the normal chaos of middle school lunch period, suddenly fell silent as students realized they were witnessing something more serious than the usual shoving or name-calling. Cell phones appeared as if by magic, with dozens of students beginning to record what they assumed would be another humiliating beatdown of the school's most vulnerable target. The few adults present, including lunch supervisors and cafeteria workers, seemed frozen in shock at the brazenness of the assault happening in such a public setting. But Marcus Thompson was not the same frightened boy who had started 7th grade. Just 2 months earlier, the weeks of harassment, combined with his grandmother's teachings about standing up to injustice and his own research into the systemic problems at his school, had transformed him into someone who understood that this moment was about much more than just his own safety or dignity. As Jake maintained his grip on Marcus's collar and began to drag him toward an even more public area of the cafeteria, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of struggling or pleading for mercy, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder that he had been carrying as part of his evidence-gathering efforts. In a clear, calm voice that somehow carried across the silent cafeteria, he began to speak directly into the device while staring Jake straight in the eyes. What he said next would not only shock every person in that room, but would set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of corruption and transform their entire school district. Marcus began by stating his full name, the date, time, and location for the record. He then calmly described what was happening to him at that moment, naming Jake, Tyler, and Brandon as his attackers and providing specific details about their actions. But what made his response truly extraordinary was what he said next. Marcus began reciting from memory specific quotes from the audio recordings he had made of the 3 bullies, including Jake's admission that his father had told him he could do whatever he wanted to students whose families didn't matter. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Jake's confident smirk disappeared as he realized that Marcus had been recording their private conversations and was now broadcasting their most incriminating statements to an audience of hundreds of students, many of whom were capturing every word on their own devices. Tyler and Brandon stepped back in obvious panic, understanding that their carefully protected reputations were crumbling in real time. The entire power dynamic that had defined their relationship with Marcus and other vulnerable students was being exposed and reversed in the most public way possible. But Marcus was not finished. He continued speaking into his recorder, this time addressing the broader audience of students, teachers, and administrators who he knew would eventually hear his words. He talked about the systematic protection of bullies by corrupt administrators, the use of wealth and political connections to silence victims, and the need for real accountability in their school system. His voice never wavered, even as Jake's grip on his collar tightened and the 3 bullies struggled to process what was happening to their carefully constructed world of immunity and privilege. The recording Marcus made that day in the cafeteria would eventually be heard by millions of people around the world, sparking conversations about bullying, institutional corruption, and the power of individual courage to challenge unjust systems. But in that moment, all anyone could see was a small 12-year-old boy refusing to be silenced or intimidated by forces that had seemed unstoppable just moments before. As Marcus continued his methodical documentation of the assault and the broader pattern of abuse it represented, something unprecedented began to happen in the cafeteria. Other students who had been victims of Jake, Tyler, and Brandon started speaking up, adding their own voices to Marcus's recording and sharing their own experiences of harassment and institutional betrayal. The circle of silence and fear that had protected the three bullies for years was finally being broken by the simple act of one brave boy who decided that truth was more important than safety. The lunch supervisors, who had initially seemed paralyzed by the situation, finally began to move toward the confrontation, but by then, the damage to the bullies' power structure had already been done. Jake released Marcus's collar and stepped back, his face pale with the realization that his father's money and connections might not be enough to contain the storm that was about to engulf their family. Tyler and Brandon were already backing toward the cafeteria exits, apparently hoping to escape before their own roles in the systemic harassment were further exposed. But Marcus was not about to let them disappear back into the shadows, where their behavior had been protected for so long. He followed them with his recorder still running, continuing to document their retreat and calling out specific incidents where each of them had participated in harassment or intimidation. Other students began to join him, creating an impromptu parade of truth-telling that followed the three bullies out of the cafeteria and into the main hallway of the school. By this point, word of what was happening had spread throughout the building. Teachers emerged from their classrooms, administrators appeared from their offices, and students poured out of other areas to witness what many would later describe as the moment when years of pent-up frustration and anger finally found its voice. The normal order of the school had been completely disrupted, but instead of chaos, there was a sense of collective awakening as people realized they were witnessing something historic. Principal Martinez arrived on the scene within minutes, accompanied by Assistant Principal Rodriguez and several security guards. But instead of the typical response of separating the students and restoring order, they found themselves facing a situation that defied their usual protocols. Marcus was not fighting or creating a disturbance in any traditional sense. He was simply telling the truth in a calm, methodical way that made it impossible to dismiss him as a troublemaker or discipline him for disruptive behavior. The principal attempted to regain control by ordering everyone to return to their classes and announcing that the situation would be handled through proper administrative channels. But Marcus, still recording, politely but firmly refused to stop documenting what he described as an ongoing assault and a pattern of institutional corruption that demanded immediate attention. He cited his right to free speech and his obligation to report criminal behavior, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of his legal protections. That caught the administrators off guard. As the crowd of students and staff continued to grow, Marcus made another strategic decision that would prove crucial to the eventual outcome of his brave stand. He announced that he was live streaming his recording to social media platforms, and that copies were being automatically backed up to cloud storage accounts that were beyond the reach of school administrators who might try to confiscate or destroy the evidence. This revelation caused visible panic among the adults, who realized they were dealing with a much more sophisticated operation than a simple schoolyard confrontation. The three bullies, meanwhile, had retreated to what they apparently considered safe territory near the main office, perhaps assuming that proximity to the administrative power structure would protect them from further exposure. But Marcus followed them there as well, continuing his real-time documentation and now expanding his focus to include the response of school officials to the crisis. He began asking pointed questions about why Jake, Tyler, and Brandon had never faced meaningful consequences for their behavior despite numerous complaints from students and parents. It was at this point that the situation took an even more dramatic turn. Several teachers who had been watching the events unfold began to speak up in support of Marcus, sharing their own experiences of being pressured to ignore or minimize reports of harassment involving the three bullies. A math teacher named Mr. James Peterson stepped forward and confirmed on camera that he had been explicitly told by administrators not to pursue disciplinary action against Jake Morrison, despite witnessing him physically assault another student. Earlier in the school year, Mrs. Angela Foster, a language arts teacher who had been at the school for over 15 years, added her voice to the growing chorus of institutional whistleblowers. She revealed that she had compiled her own documentation of incidents involving the 3 bullies and their protected status within the school hierarchy. Mrs. Foster had been planning to submit her evidence to the state education department, but had been waiting for the right moment when she would have sufficient support to avoid retaliation from the district administration. The presence of multiple adult witnesses who were willing to corroborate Marcus's allegations transformed the situation from what administrators might have dismissed as a teenage dispute into a full-blown institutional crisis. The careful documentation that Marcus and his grandmother had been gathering for weeks was now being supported by professional educators who had their own evidence of systemic corruption and abuse of power. As word of the confrontation spread beyond the school building, parents began arriving on campus demanding answers about the situation involving their children. Dorothy Thompson, who had been contacted by a neighbor whose daughter attended the school, arrived to find her grandson at the center of a media storm that was rapidly growing beyond anything they had anticipated. But instead of being frightened or overwhelmed by the attention, Marcus continued his methodical documentation, now explaining to arriving parents and reporters exactly what he had discovered about the corruption within their school district. The response from the families of the 3 bullies was swift and predictable. Robert Morrison arrived within an hour, accompanied by expensive lawyers who immediately began trying to shut down the recording and threatening legal action against anyone who continued to document his son's behavior. Superintendent Linda Chen rushed to the school from the district office, clearly in damage control mode as she realized that her own conflicts of interest were about to be exposed to public scrutiny. But the momentum of truth-telling that Marcus had started was now beyond anyone's ability to contain or control. Students continued to share their own stories of harassment and institutional betrayal. Teachers added their voices to the growing chorus of witnesses, and parents demanded immediate action to address the systemic problems that had been hidden from public view for too long. The digital recording that Marcus had started in the cafeteria was already being shared across social media platforms, where it was gaining thousands of views and generating passionate discussions about bullying, corruption, and the power of individual courage to challenge unjust systems. News outlets began picking up the story, recognizing that what had started as a school incident was actually a case study in how wealth and political connections could corrupt public institutions and silence victims of abuse. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the events at Riverside Middle School were going to have consequences far beyond anything anyone had imagined. When Marcus Thompson walked into the cafeteria for lunch that day, the brave decision of one 12-year-old boy to refuse to be silenced had opened a floodgate of revelations that would ultimately transform not just his own life, but the entire culture of their educational community. The foundation of fear and silence that had protected Jake Morrison, Tyler Chen, and Brandon Walsh for years had been shattered in a single afternoon by the simple power of truth, spoken with courage and conviction. But as Marcus would soon discover, exposing corruption and abuse of power was only the beginning of a much longer and more difficult battle for real justice and meaningful change. The chaos that erupted in the aftermath of Marcus's recording created ripple effects that no one at Riverside Middle School could have anticipated. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times across multiple social media platforms, with hashtags like #SavaMarcus and #ExposeReversedOrder trending nationally. News crews from 3 different television stations had gathered outside the school gates by evening, while investigative journalists began making phone calls to verify the explosive allegations that H had been captured on camera. Dorothy Thompson found herself thrust into the role of family spokesperson as reporters sought interviews about her grandson's brave stand against institutional corruption. She handled the media attention with the same dignity and determination that had characterized her 40-year career in education, carefully explaining the months of documentation and research that had led up to Marcus's dramatic revelation in the cafeteria. Her detailed knowledge of the district's financial irregularities and pattern of protecting privileged students provided crucial context that transformed the story from a simple bullying incident into a complex investigation of systemic abuse. The Thompson family's small house became an impromptu headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a community-wide movement for accountability and reform. Parents whose children had been victimized by the same network of protected bullies began reaching out, sharing their own stories, and offering evidence that corroborated the patterns Marcus had exposed. Teachers who had been silenced or intimidated for trying to enforce discipline against influential students found their voices and started speaking publicly about the pressure they had faced from administrators. Meanwhile, the three families at the center of the scandal were mobilizing their considerable resources to contain the damage and discredit Marcus's allegations. Robert Morrison hired a crisis management firm specializing in reputation protection for wealthy families facing public scrutiny. The firm immediately began spreading alternative narratives through social media, suggesting that Marcus had fabricated or manipulated the recordings, and that his grandmother was using him to pursue a personal vendetta against successful community members. Superintendent Linda Chen called an emergency meeting of the school board, ostensibly to address the disruption at Riverside Middle School, but actually to coordinate a unified response that would protect her own position and the district's reputation. The closed-door session lasted nearly 4 hours, with board members receiving briefings from the district's legal counsel about potential liability issues and strategies for minimizing public exposure of their conflicts of interest. The Walsh family took a different approach, leveraging their political connections to pressure local media outlets to limit their coverage of the story. Brandon's father made calls to newspaper editors and television station managers, reminding them of his family's advertising expenditures and suggesting that continued coverage might not be in their business interests. Several smaller media outlets immediately scaled back their reporting, but the story had already gained too much momentum on social media for traditional gatekeepers to control the narrative effectively. As the investigation expanded, Dorothy Thompson connected with Maria Santos, a local civil rights attorney who had been monitoring the Riverside School District for several years due to concerns about discriminatory disciplinary practices. Attorney Santos had compiled her own documentation of cases where minority students faced harsher punishments than their white counterparts for similar infractions, and she immediately recognized the broader implications of Marcus's evidence about systematic protection for privileged students. The legal dimension of the case became even more complex when forensic analysis of Marcus's digital recordings confirmed their authenticity and revealed additional evidence that had not been apparent in the initial review. Computer specialists discovered that the metadata from Jake Morrison's cyberbullying activities could be traced back to specific times and locations, providing irrefutable proof of criminal behavior that went far beyond typical schoolyard harassment. Most damaging of all was the discovery of email communications between Robert Morrison and Superintendent Chen that had been automatically backed up to district servers. These messages revealed explicit discussions about protecting Jake from consequences and strategizing ways to discredit families who filed complaints against him. One particularly incriminating exchange included Chen's promise to handle the Thompson situation in exchange for Morrison's support for her contract renewal and a substantial donation to the district's building fund. The revelation of these communications created a firestorm of controversy that reached far beyond the immediate school community. State education officials announced they would be conducting their own investigation into the district's practices, while the Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into potential criminal violations related to the cyberbullying and conspiracy to deprive students of their civil rights. Marcus himself became a reluctant celebrity as his story spread across national news networks and social media platforms. Interview requests poured in from major television programs and magazines, all eager to feature the brave young man who had stood up to institutional corruption with nothing but truth and determination. Dorothy carefully screened these requests, accepting only those that would help advance their cause of systemic reform, while protecting Marcus from exploitation or overwhelming media pressure. The impact on Riverside Middle School's daily operations was immediate and dramatic. Attendance dropped significantly as parents kept their children home rather than send them into what many perceived as an unsafe and corrupt environment. Teachers reported that classroom discussions were dominated by conversations about the scandal, with students sharing their own experiences of harassment and institutional indifference that had previously been kept secret. Principal Martinez found herself caught between conflicting pressures from district administrators who wanted to minimize the crisis and her own growing awareness of the systemic problems that had been hidden from her view. As more teachers came forward with their stories of being pressured to ignore disciplinary infractions by connected students, she began to understand that her authority as principal had been deliberately undermined by forces operating outside the normal chain of command. The financial aspects of the corruption became clearer as investigative journalists began examining public records and district budgets with unprecedented scrutiny. They discovered that Morrison's construction companies had been awarded no-bid contracts worth millions of dollars over the previous 5 years, often for projects that were completed significantly over budget or failed to meet basic quality standards. The Walsh family's charitable donations, meanwhile, had been structured in ways that provided them with tax benefits while giving them disproportionate influence over district policies and personnel decisions. Most troubling was the revelation that Superintendent Chen had used her position to steer district business toward companies owned by her personal friends and political allies, creating a network of mutual benefit that operated with little oversight from the school board. The board members themselves had been kept in the dark about many of these arrangements, though several admitted they had suspected irregularities, but had been reluctant to challenge Chen's authority due to her reputation and political connections. The psychological impact on students throughout the district was profound and complex. Many expressed relief that the culture of fear and silence was finally being exposed, but others worried about the long-term consequences of challenging such powerful families. Support groups formed organically as students who had been isolated by their experiences of harassment discovered they were part of a much larger community of victims who had been systematically silenced and ignored. Marcus continued to document developments in his case, maintaining detailed records of threats and intimidation attempts that increased dramatically. As the investigation expanded, anonymous messages warned him and his grandmother to stop pursuing their allegations, while suspicious vehicles were spotted outside their home at various hours. Dorothy contacted law enforcement about these incidents, but the response was inconsistent, with some officers taking the reports seriously, while others seemed skeptical about the need for protection. The digital evidence that Marcus had gathered proved to be even more extensive than initially realized. Computer forensics experts discovered that Jake Morrison's hacking activities had targeted dozens of students over a period of several years, with stolen personal information being used to create fake social media profiles, distribute embarrassing photos, and coordinate harassment campaigns that drove several victims to transfer schools or require psychological counseling. The scope of the cyberbullying operation shocked even experienced investigators who had dealt with similar cases. The level of technical sophistication suggested that Jake had received training or assistance from adults, raising questions about whether his father's technology companies had provided resources or expertise for these illegal activities. Bank records subpoenaed as part of the expanding investigation revealed payments to various individuals who appeared to have provided computer services to the Morrison family, though the specific nature of these services remained unclear. As the criminal investigation gained momentum, the three families at the center of the scandal began turning on each other in an attempt to minimize their own legal exposure. The Walsh family's attorneys suggested that their son Brandon had been a reluctant participant who was pressured into joining the harassment by the more dominant personalities of Jake and Tyler. The Chen family, meanwhile, argued that Tyler's involvement had been minimal and that Superintendent Chen's professional relationship with the Morrison family had not influenced her response to complaints about Jake's behavior. These attempts to shift blame and responsibility created additional fractures in what had previously been a unified front of wealthy families, protecting their privileged position within the community. Former allies began providing information to investigators about each other's activities, revealing even more extensive patterns of corruption and abuse that had been hidden from public view. The investigation also uncovered evidence of systematic grade manipulation and academic fraud that had benefited students from influential families. Teachers came forward with stories of being pressured to change grades or provide unearned academic credits to maintain the GPA letters of students whose parents made substantial donations to the district. College recommendation letters had been written by administrators rather than teachers who actually knew the students, while standardized test scores had been altered to improve the chances of admission to prestigious universities. Most damaging was the discovery that several students from connected families had been admitted to advanced programs and honors classes, despite failing to meet the established criteria, while qualified students from less influential backgrounds had been denied these opportunities. The systematic nature of these violations suggested a coordinated effort to maintain educational advantages for a privileged elite, while limiting opportunities for other students. The broader community response to these revelations was swift and overwhelming. Parent groups that had previously operated independently began coordinating their efforts to demand comprehensive reform of the district's governance and accountability systems. Petition drives collected thousands of signatures, calling for the resignation of Superintendent Chen and the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms to prevent future corruption. Student achievement had actually improved as teachers felt empowered to maintain consistent standards without fear of political interference. Dorothy Thompson addressed the media outside the courthouse after the verdict was announced. Jake Morrison had been sentenced to juvenile detention and community service, while his father received a 12-year federal prison sentence. Superintendent Chen's cooperation had earned her a reduced sentence, but she was permanently barred from working in education. The systemic changes mandated by the settlement would affect every school district in the state. The civil settlement awarded substantial damages to Marcus and dozens of other victims, but more importantly, it required the implementation of comprehensive anti-bullying programs and independent monitoring systems that would prevent future abuse. The money would fund scholarships for students who had been denied opportunities due to the corrupt practices, ensuring that the next generation would have access to fair treatment regardless of their families, wealth, or connections. Marcus used his platform to advocate for other young people facing similar situations across the country. His foundation, established with proceeds from the settlement, provided resources and support for students fighting institutional discrimination. The shy 7th grader, who had been grabbed by his collar in a school cafeteria, had become a national voice for educational justice and accountability. The ripple effects extended far beyond Riverside, as school districts nationwide examined their own practices and implemented reforms to prevent similar corruption. Federal legislation strengthened protections for students reporting harassment, while increasing penalties for officials who abuse their positions. The case became a model for how communities could hold powerful interests accountable when they prioritized privilege over justice. Jake Morrison's transformation during his detention was perhaps the most surprising outcome of the entire ordeal. Removed from his father's toxic influence and forced to confront the real consequences of his actions, he began working with counselors to understand the harm he had caused. His eventual public apology to Marcus was genuine and heartfelt, marking the beginning of his own journey toward redemption. The three families that had once dominated Riverside's power structure were forever changed by their downfall. Robert Morrison's businesses were sold to pay restitution and legal fees. The Chen family relocated to another state, hoping to rebuild their lives away from the scandal. The Walsh family's political influence evaporated as their corruption was exposed, ending a dynasty that had controlled local politics for generations. Years later, Marcus would reflect on how a single moment of courage had changed not just his own life, but the lives of countless other students who had been failed by a corrupt system. His refusal to be silenced had broken a cycle of abuse that had persisted for years, proving that truth and determination could triumph over even the most entrenched corruption. The hallways of Riverside Middle School now displayed banners promoting respect, integrity, and accountability. The culture of fear had been replaced by an environment where all students felt safe to learn and grow. Teachers reported higher job satisfaction as they could focus on education rather than navigating political pressures from influential families. Dorothy Thompson retired from her advocacy work, knowing that her grandson's courage had created lasting change that would protect future generations of students. The boy who had been targeted for his perceived weakness had become the catalyst for the most significant educational reform in their state's history. Marcus graduated as valedictorian, his academic achievements no longer overshadowed by the harassment that had once made school a place of fear. His acceptance speech emphasized the importance of standing up for others and the power of individual action to create systemic change. The audience included many of the teachers and students who had supported him during the darkest days of the scandal. The digital recording that started it all was preserved in the National Archives as part of a collection documenting landmark civil rights cases. Marcus's calm voice stating his name and describing the assault would serve as inspiration for future generations of young people facing similar challenges in their own communities. The transformation was complete. A culture of corruption and privilege had been dismantled through the courage of one young person who refused to accept that wealth and connections placed anyone above accountability. The boy they had tried to silence had found his voice and used it to speak for everyone who had been denied justice for too long. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Local business leaders who had previously supported the status quo began distancing themselves from the families at the center of the scandal as public opinion shifted decisively against the culture of privilege and immunity that had enabled the abuse. Advertisers pulled their support from media outlets that had initially tried to downplay the story, while community organizations canceled events and partnerships that would have benefited the Morrison, Chen, and Walsh families. The political ramifications extended beyond the school district as elected officials at various levels found themselves under pressure to explain their own relationships with the families involved in the scandal. Campaign finance records revealed extensive donations from these families to local politicians, raising questions about whether public officials had been influenced to ignore or suppress complaints about the school district's practices. State legislators announced plans to introduce new laws strengthening oversight of school districts and increasing penalties for officials who abuse their positions for personal benefit. Federal authorities indicated they were monitoring the situation to determine whether civil rights violations had occurred that would warrant intervention under federal education and anti-discrimination statutes. The transformation of public opinion was perhaps most evident in the changed atmosphere at Riverside Middle School itself. Students who had previously been afraid to speak up about harassment or unfair treatment began coming forward with their own stories, creating a snowball effect that revealed the true extent of the problems that had been hidden for years. Teachers reported feeling more empowered to enforce discipline and academic standards without fear of administrative retaliation. The culture of fear and silence that had enabled the systematic abuse was being replaced by an environment where transparency and accountability were becoming the new norms. Students organized their own support networks and advocacy groups, while teachers formed committees to develop new policies that would prevent the concentration of power and influence that had allowed the corruption to flourish. Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of this transformation, serving as both a symbol of courage and a catalyst for broader change. His methodical approach to documenting abuse and his refusal to be intimidated by powerful interests had inspired others to find their own voices and demand justice. The young man who had been targeted for harassment because of his perceived vulnerability had become the unlikely leader of a movement that would reshape his entire community's approach to education and accountability. The investigation was far from over, but the foundation of secrecy and intimidation that had protected the corrupt system for years had been irreparably damaged. The truth that Marcus had spoken with such courage in that school cafeteria had set in motion forces that would ultimately transform not just his own life, but the lives of countless other students who had suffered in silence for too long. As winter approached and the investigation continued to expand, it became clear that the events initiated by Marcus's brave stand would have consequences that reached far beyond Riverside Middle School. The pattern of corruption and abuse that had been exposed was already being identified in other districts across the state, suggesting that the problems at Riverside were part of a much larger crisis in educational governance and accountability. The courage of one 12-year-old boy with a digital recorder had opened the door to a reckoning that would ultimately transform how communities across the nation thought about power, privilege, and the responsibility to protect all students from harassment and institutional abuse. The investigation was entering a new phase, one that would test whether the momentum for change could be sustained against the considerable resources and influence of those who benefited from the corrupt status quo. The federal courthouse steps were packed with supporters as Marcus Thompson, now 13, walked hand in hand with his grandmother toward the building where the final chapter of their year-long battle would unfold. The case had grown far beyond a simple bullying incident, becoming a landmark federal civil rights lawsuit that would establish new precedents for holding school districts accountable for systematic discrimination and corruption. Jake Morrison sat beside his father's expensive legal team, his once confident demeanor replaced by nervous fidgeting, as he faced felony charges for cyberstalking and violation of computer privacy laws. The evidence against him was overwhelming, with digital forensics revealing a sophisticated harassment network that had targeted over 40 students across 3 school years. His privileged immunity had evaporated completely when federal investigators discovered that his activities had crossed state lines through online platforms. Superintendent Linda Chen had already pleaded guilty to conspiracy and corruption charges in exchange for cooperation with prosecutors. Her testimony revealed the full extent of the pay-to-play system that had governed the Riverside School District for nearly a decade. The courtroom gasped when she described explicit agreements to protect wealthy students from consequences in exchange for donations and business contracts worth millions of dollars. The Walsh family's attempts to distance themselves from the scandal had backfired spectacularly when investigators uncovered evidence that Brandon's father had personally threatened teachers who tried to discipline his son. Phone records and witness testimony painted a picture of systematic intimidation that went far beyond mere parental advocacy, crossing into criminal obstruction of justice. Robert Morrison's empire was crumbling as contract irregularities and bid-rigging schemes came to light through the investigation. His construction companies faced federal charges for fraud, while his personal assets were frozen pending restitution proceedings. The man who had once boasted that his money could buy immunity for his son now faced the possibility of decades in federal prison. Marcus testified with the same calm determination that had characterized his original cafeteria recording. He spoke directly to the jury about the culture of fear that had dominated his school, explaining how systematic protection of bullies had created an environment where vulnerable students were afraid to seek help. His testimony was powerful not just for its content, but for the remarkable poise and maturity he demonstrated under intense cross-examination from defense attorneys. The transformation at Riverside Middle School had been dramatic and comprehensive. Principal Martinez, who had been cleared of wrongdoing after cooperating fully with the investigation, had implemented new policies requiring transparency in all disciplinary decisions and creating independent oversight mechanisms to prevent future corruption.